you. Statements by ministers, congratulatory and/or obituary speeches, personal explanations, motions for leave of absence, or replies to questions, notices of motions for the adjournment of the House on matters of urgent public importance, orders of the day.
Honourable Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the suspension of standing orders 6, 16, 18, 20, 42, subsection 5, 43, and 44 for the remainder of the day's sitting.
Question is that the aforementioned standing orders be suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The aforementioned standing orders are hereby suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting.
Government business. Go ahead.
Honourable Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the following bills be withdrawn and replaced in the following order. Order number 2, the Stormwater Management Bill 2024 be withdrawn and substituted by the Stormwater Management Bill 2025, dated the 31st of March 2025. Also, order number 10, the Integrated Coastal and Marine Management Bill to be withdrawn and substituted by the Integrated Coastal and Marine Management Bill, dated 3rd of April 2025, and also to withdraw order number 11, the Barbados National Honours and Decorations Amendment Bill 2025, and substitute this bill with the same title, dated 21st of April 2025. The replacement bills were given notice of earlier and read a first time, Mr. Speaker. In addition, I would wish to withdraw, not substitute, but withdraw order number 12, the Insurance Amendment Bill 2025.
The question is that orders number 2, 10, 11, and 12 be accordingly withdrawn. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Orders number 2, 10, 11, and 12 are thereby withdrawn.
Mr. Speaker, in the name of the Deputy Prime Minister, Senior Minister, Minister of Transport and Works, Leader of Government Business, to move the second reading of the Stormwater Management Bill 2024.
Honourable Leader of Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise this morning to introduce the Stormwater Management Bill, which is a bill that will repeal and replace what is currently on the statute books as the Prevention of Floods Act, Cap 235 of the laws of Barbados. Now, the Prevention of Floods legislation was first enacted back in 1951. And as the name implies, it would have focused on preventing floods. I think that's a fairly logical conclusion. It has been amended on about 5 occasions to date. And the last time it was amended was in 1998. We had some major changes back in 1996 when the former representative for St. Andrew, who was at the time the then Minister of Public Works, Transport and Housing, would have been leading the ministry. He would have brought certain amendments to that piece of legislation arising out of, I believe, what is known to many Barbadians as the Western floods in St. James, which resulted in the loss of life of a very popular Calypsonian in this island called the Mighty Karoo. The view at the time was that there were certain lands for which a developer had been blocking a watercourse, and as a consequence of those actions, it caused damage to the adjoining lands. It resulted in almost 12,000 cubic meters of water being impounded across the areas surrounding the obstruction, and resulted in significant damage to a number of homes and indeed the loss of life of the mighty Karoo. The amendments at the time, however, sought to enable the ministry at the time, it would have been falling under the drainage unit, to allow the drainage unit of the Ministry of Public Works at the time to allow its officers through the CTO, Chief Technical Officer, to be able to go onto private property to clear the drains and to clear wells which might threaten neighboring property, and also provided a very critical element, which was the recoupment of money compensation in the event that government had to incur certain costs to make good any of the damage that had been caused as a result of a developer placing structures within a watercourse or any other area. Now, one could say that maybe it was reactionary, and at the time, obviously, if it's against the background of Barbados having that type of significant event, which I was quite young, and I recall the concerns about the floods in Weston. But the truth of the matter is that when we look back at this legislation, while at the time it may have been the right thing to do, it is clear that there were a number of, and I don't want to say loopholes, but there were a number of things that could have been done perhaps to tighten the legislation, to enable the drainage unit to better and be more efficient in the execution of its duties. Now, I'm mindful that around the same time that the amendments were made in 1996, Mr. Speaker, the drainage unit was also relatively new. It was in its infancy stages. And therefore, the knowledge that the drainage unit has certainly become known for today, it certainly did not have at its disposal back in the late 1990s. And so Barbados as well at that time was, I presume, was like how we are in many cases today, where we believe that God is a Bajan, that we are so far off out of the island chain that we were experiencing over the previous couple hundred years a number of systems that would slightly impact Barbados, brush Barbados, and then go on to the other islands and cause significant dislocation and damage. And obviously at the time, I think the last system probably was back in 1949, prior to the passage of the Prevention of Floods legislation, which really resulted in about 10 inches of rain across a number of the rural parishes, which by today's standard, obviously we are seeing significantly large numbers of water being dumped across the country when we have even the briefest period of rain across the island. So this piece of legislation, the Prevention of Floods Act, was primarily concerned more with flood prevention. This particular bill that I'm introducing today adopts a more comprehensive approach towards stormwater management. And it recognizes that stormwater management is an essential component of overall water resource management. It recognizes that you have to incorporate the elements of mitigation and adaptive response strategies as well if you're going to get serious about dealing with storm water. The fact that climate change is no longer a distant threat is also another compelling reason for us being able to revisit this legislation and to make a determination that we need to move in a different direction if we are going to be ready for any eventuality, and certainly to be able to share the burden of responsibilities under legislation. Climate change has been significantly influencing stormwater management because it alters the weather patterns, it increases the occurrence of weather and extreme events, and it is obviously exacerbating existing challenges. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that I'm sure if every member in this chamber were to speak today, he or she will speak to long-standing matters in the drainage unit. that they have complained about where infrastructure has not been fixed, where they have experienced blockages in relation to persons encroaching in areas where there are water courses or even within our gullies, and simply that the flow of water is in many cases being obstructed because other people have done things that have caused that obstruction, which then creates another problem for people within the various communities. I am sure that if time permits and each one of them stands in this chamber to speak, they will also tell a tale of a lot of the infrastructure being broken, which would allow us to be able to get the water off of the roads quickly. And they will also tell the tale of having severe challenges in being able to remove debris in their communities, which again, when we think about the plastics and stuff that make its way into the drains, we can appreciate why there is severe flooding sometimes, not just in a particular community, but also starting upstream, which results in the flooding of areas downstream as well. A lot of these factors have therefore led for us to have a further look at updating our infrastructure, making sure that our culverts and our sidewalks and stuff can hold the water in terms of the runoff, and to also look at revising the current legislation that is before us. The fact is that the current legislation and the infrastructure are both outdated, and they would have been based on old and outdated climate models. Consequently, it means, therefore, that the new laws and this particular storm management bill is needed to address these critical areas and to ensure that we're able to integrate floodplain management, address the issues of pollution control, and obviously allow ourselves to be able to have a governance structure that allows the entities tasked with carrying out these important functions of overseeing stormwater to be able to do so with the teeth that is required by law. I therefore want, before I start to introduce the bill though, to mention as well that a number of challenges would have existed under the current legislation. The fact that the Prevention of Floods bill relies heavily on flood control measures in response to flood disasters has meant that obviously we have not been able to respond in the way that we would want to. The Act at the time was based on an approach which was used coming out of a report in 1973 by Evan Wallace on the South and West Coast stormwater drainage, which would have indicated that that approach was more focused in the legislation on the use of structural measures for flood prevention. Put simply, the focus was more on the construction or the enlargement of drains, of culverts, of our roadways, and a heavy reliance back then on our suck wells. So that piece of legislation, the Prevention of Floods, was really focused on what was the available information at the time. Build larger drains, extend the culverts more so that the water could flow heavily, but it did not take into account all the other myriad of issues that obviously require us to be more preventative in our approach to having to then have to deal with the issues of flooding. Things, however, started to be viewed a little bit differently following a 1973 study known as the Cumming-Cockburn South and West Coast Stormwater Drainage Study. The study, for the first time in this country, adopted a flood risk management approach, and it's also recommended modifications to strengthen the ability to rectify drainage problems. It required that there be certain prohibited areas for building. It also placed prohibitions on persons from dumping, as well as the retention of quarries and detention reservoirs for flood control works. So again, the focus in that study was on a more comprehensive, integrated approach to water resource management. The input for this current bill was then influenced by that study, as well as the 2018 drainage study entitled Adaptation Measures to Counter the Effects of Climate Change, also known as AMSEC. This study undertook an integrated approach to flood resilience and water resource management. And it also combined the findings of the Coastal Assessment and Risk Management Plan and the Gully Ecosystem Management Study of 2005. These studies recommended alternatives for flood mitigation, including improving the culverts, as well as adopting best management practices, and also having low-impact development approaches. The impetus for this new law that we are going to discuss today was also driven by the World Meteorological Organization's model of what is known as the integrated flood management. This is a model which prescribes land and water resources development within a watershed basin approach. In other words, it views the watershed as an interconnected system. It recognizes that water quality and quantity are interconnected with other aspects of the environment, such as land use, biodiversity, and human health. And this approach emphasizes collaboration amongst our various stakeholders and also the development of integrated solutions to address a number of our priority problems. So while the Drainage Division plans on a daily basis and carries out activities in accordance with the integrated flood management model, the law, however, governing them, which is the Prevention of Floods Act currently, however, is silent on that integrated approach. And therefore, taking all of that into account, the fact that we have moved away from more of a structural approach to being able to now look at a more of a flood management approach, how do we deal with stormwater management before these incidences take place? This is the reason why the Drainage Unit would have started the review of the challenges that it was facing with the existing legislation and would have identified about 59 challenges that they encounter on a daily basis which impact the flow of stormwater across the island. In 2021, the ministry would have begun the process of requesting amendments to be done to the existing legislation. But certainly by the time we started to review it later, we realized that it could not simply be minor amendments to definitions or minor amendments to particular sections of the legislation that was required. But in truth and in fact, an entirely new approach needed to be taken, which sought to clarify and make it certainly simpler to understand for the ordinary Barbadian, as well as our developers and anyone picking up the legislation, trying to understand what their rights and responsibilities would be. So, Mr. Speaker, as I begin to introduce this bill, I am mindful that the name of the bill may not be clearly understood by some. Stormwater isn't just water pelting down in a storm, as some may view it. I'm sure many persons listening might say, what is it that we're debating in the Parliament today, talking about stormwater? I think perhaps the first reaction is that, you know, in a storm there's water, so how are we managing the water from a storm? But when we speak of stormwater, it is actually the rain that runs off the roofs of our houses, of our offices, office structures. It is the rain that runs into the streets and certainly across our parking lots that play a critical role in terms of their destination, because many times the water ends up within the water stream of what we drink, what we utilize on a daily basis. And therefore, it has a major role to play in how we treat to it within our communities and certainly our overall health. The reality is that in the natural environment, when rain falls, the rain is absorbed into the ground. You see the filtration through the soil, and of course, the process of replenishment takes place. When the same rain, however, falls on concrete, on asphalt, and on our rooftops, it often has nowhere to go. It runs off quickly, oftentimes collecting pollutants like oil and trash and pesticides and heavy metals, and it washes them directly into our waterways. This is what we refer to as stormwater runoff. It is one of the leading causes of the flooding. It is also one of the leading causes of erosion, It is one of the leading causes of damage to our precious infrastructure as well. And all of this ends up costing us millions of dollars each year. And therefore, what we are about to discuss by this new piece of legislation is how do we solve this problem. Before I begin as well, I want to point out that I had the opportunity to read the debate from when the amendments were made by the previous member for St. Andrew in this place to the current legislation. And what I found particularly interesting, Mr. Speaker, is that one of the solutions that was put forward for addressing the issue of flooding in the western area was some repairs to some bridge infrastructure that would certainly have cost the government about $2 million. And one of the points that was made in that debate is really that it is important for us to be able to be more proactive in how we deal with this issue of flooding. Because if it is going to cost us $2 million and perhaps loss of life as a result of not taking the precautionary steps, then perhaps we need to pause and make sure that we have the legislation tightened to ensure that the officers who are tasked with the responsibility on a daily basis of inspecting infrastructure, of authorizing in both drainage and also in the planning unit, that they have specific guidelines that they must follow. Equally, that the persons who want to develop lands, that they also are clear in terms of their duties and also their responsibilities as well in ensuring that this storm water is collected properly and certainly disposed of in the correct way so as not to cause challenges for other people living in communities in and around their surrounding area. So this current bill is actually divided into 7 parts, which is a vast improvement on certainly the current legislation. The first part deals with all of the preliminary details in relation to the interpretation, the acts which bind the state, and the administration generally of the act. Part 2 addresses the flood zones and flood works. Part 3 addresses duties of owners and occupiers. Part 4 speaks to the duties of our land developers. Part 5 to general prohibitions. Part 6 to enforcement. And Part 7 is an all-encompassing clause which deals with miscellaneous provisions. So this act would essentially, once this bill becomes law, would essentially do the following things. It is going to authorize the minister responsible for storm water management to be able to designate specific areas as flood zones. It empowers the chief technical officer to plan and to carry out flood mitigation projects, allows the chief technical officer or another authorized representative to execute planned flood works in various districts, allows the chief technical officer or another authorized person to enter premises regarding planned flood works that have been agreed by the ministry. It grants the chief technical officer or his representative the authority to carry out flood works in emergency situations, and this is going to be a very critical discussion as well. It enables the chief technical officer to organize the maintenance of drainage infrastructure and certainly to now improve on the work that is currently being done. It will prohibit individuals from constructing buildings within a designated flood zone. It will restrict the planting of trees and crops in those designated flood zones. It will require landowners engaged in commercial or industrial activities to install stormwater disposal systems. It will mandate that outfalls and drainage reserves be kept clear of obstructions. It will require regular inspection and cleaning of the stormwater drainage wells and structures, as well as require landowners to construct adequate drainage systems to mitigate the risk of flooding. A number of enforcement mechanisms are also addressed in this piece of legislation, and also the area of compensation to persons affected is also included, along with the issue of the discharge of liability for certain acts as well. So if I start, Mr. Speaker, first of all, by taking you through this particular piece of legislation, allow me to point out, first of all, that one of the first things that had to be done was to properly define a number of the terms that are used in relation to stormwater management in the new bill. Because the old legislation did not even define properly or at all the chief technical officer. It did not address properly the ministry responsible in terms of, at the time, it was the minister responsible for communications. In this piece of legislation, you will see that it is now focused on the minister responsible for stormwater management. It makes clear the responsibilities within the legislation that the various parties are obviously responsible for. But at the crux of it is now an intention, rather, to be able to designate an area as a flood zone, because this we see as being able to allow people to kind of know if they're going to build, whether as a developer or otherwise, whether a particular area is indeed prone to flooding. So the definition of flood zone is also captured in the legislation as well, which basically is an area that has been declared under Section 5 to be an area where there is significant risk of flooding. This provision at Section 5 grants the minister, in consultation, and this is critical because I know in other debates we've heard that the minister has too much power, but I want to make it clear that in this particular legislation, the minister grants, is after consultation with the chief technical officer, and obviously on the recommendation of the chief technical officer, essentially declares an area to be a flood zone. The minister is also required to now present a map which shows the proposed flood zone to both houses of parliament. So essentially, we will lay that here. We will also lay that in the Senate as well. The previous act provided no definition of a flood zone, but instead defined a flood area as an area declared by the minister to be a flood area. So what we found is that the terminology in the previous legislation was a bit complicated, not very clear, not properly defined, and we sought to be able to bring some level of clarity to this existing piece of legislation. While some of the definitions, though, have been retained, and you will see a number of them retained for the purposes of this bill, there is now obviously a more expansive list of definitions that now exist. We've recognized the role of the Director of Planning and Development. The terminology for watershed has also been defined. Specifically, the terminology as to who constitutes a land developer has also been clearly articulated as well. We've defined the terminology for a highway, flood zone, what is a flood, and also what would be defined as a flood works plan as well. If I take you, Mr. Speaker, then to Section 6 of the new bill, it empowers the Chief Technical Officer to plan flood mitigation projects. This was really formally Section 3 of the old Prevention of Floods Act. And this section requires the Chief Technical Officer to really proactively plan flood management initiatives for the minister's approval. These plans are critical, obviously, for ensuring the public safety, for environmental protection, and to ensure long-term resilience against increasing climate risk. Under the old law, the CTO was required from time to time to prepare plans for the approval of the minister for the execution of flood works in the flood area. Those plans would reflect the limits of the flood area. They would have reflected the line level and the type of floods which were, in the opinion of the CTO, necessary for protecting persons and premises from floods and inundations of water. Notice of the approved plan would then be given to any persons whose land, whose premises, plants, trees, or crops might be affected by the flood works. And the CTO also had back then, under this current legislation, to deposit to the registration office copies of the plans, and then those plans could be inspected by the public free of charge. Under this new bill, the process is relatively similar. However, what is different is that there is now a time limit of 28 days, which has been imposed on the Chief Technical Officer, within which he must submit the approved plans to the Registrar of Titles. Additionally, any individual whose property is affected must also be notified within the 28-day period. So the previous legislation didn't provide a timeline, which I suspect was probably one of the deficiencies, in that there was no requirement by law to be able to submit these plans and to file them. This legislation now places the onus, once approved, for the CTO to basically seek to have these flood plans filed. Section 7, which was been formerly Section 4 under the old legislation. This empowers the Chief Technical Officer or an authorized representative to carry out the planned flood works. And they have to provide notice to the owner or the occupier of the premises affected by the flood works at least 14 days prior to commencement of the work. Under the previous Prevention of Floods legislation, while it recognized the CTO as the officer with responsibility for executing the functions under the Act, it did not recognize that the CTO often delegates these functions to his authorized representatives, namely the officers who exist within the drainage division. And therefore, as you know, as bright lawyer will argue that the officers ain't got no right to be doing enforcement under the legislation. So again, we had to seek to clarify that it is not just the CTO on his direction, but also any authorized representative of the CTO, which would encompass all of the officers that carry out effectively the functions within the current drainage unit, or any other person authorized by the CTO to give effect to the legislation on the CTO's behalf. The bill, as I said earlier, also defines the CTO as the CTO in the ministry responsible for public works. Again, previously, there was no definition of Chief Technical Officer. The requirement to give notice to owners and occupiers of premises is also new. And again, you will see this as a common vein throughout this piece of new legislation, whereby we recognize that while, and we'll come to the issue of emergency works, while in an emergency, the ministry has to act quickly. Equally, there are times where if you have planned the works, you can give notice to the individual homeowners or persons within the general neighborhood that work is going to be effected on a particular date, or that access is required to be granted. So it allows for, I would hope, a lessening of tension sometimes, which I think has sometimes existed, where the officers may require to enter premises, or they're seen at somebody's premises, but there's really no formal notice being given to them, maybe apart from currently our communications unit actually giving notice online and in social media that works are ongoing by the drainage unit in a particular area. So this seeks to address that concern that I believe has been expressed over and over again. At Section 8, which would have been formerly Section 5, this provision allows the Chief Technical Officer or an authorized representative to enter premises after giving 48 hours notice to the owner or occupier. And this entry is specified in the bill for specific purposes, one of which is undertaking necessary work for the preparation of flood plans. So essentially, you know that you've got your flood plan, but you need to make sure that you go in and you have a clear schedule as to what you are going to do in the next few weeks leading up to the execution of those works. It would also allow for the estimation and preparation of flood works to be executed. So again, the officers will be able to go in, make the necessary assessments as to what needs to be done, and certainly be able to prepare their plans, prepare their costings with a view to being able to execute the works. Sometimes you need to gain entry as well, because if the work is going to be outsourced, somebody externally may have to come to the site and to be able to view the scope of the works and submit a quotation for the works to be done. And of course, the other reason for giving the 48 hours notice to the owner or occupier would be where they are evaluating the compensation to be paid to the owner of the premises in connection with the work. So again, there may be some costs that are incurred which need to be addressed up front so that we know what the cost of going in is going to be in terms of executing the works, and therefore they need to be able to gain entry to the premises in order to be able to do so. And then finally, the final one will be to execute the flood works in the actual flood works plan. So there are really no significant changes in this section. However, it addresses the issue of notice required for the preparatory work to be done by the Chief Technical Officer and his or her representatives to be done in order to be able to execute the flood works. The next section that I would wish to point out would be Section 9, which is the one that gives the Chief Technical Officer the power to enter premises without prior notice in order to execute flood works, where, and it is very clear, where there's an imminent danger of flooding. So essentially where this is to carry out emergency works. This is to prevent flooding, it is to mitigate the risk of flooding, or to facilitate the drainage of water. And from time to time, when we know that there is a system pending, oftentimes because obstructions may have been brought to the attention of the drainage unit, it becomes important for the officers to have to go into the field and clear certain areas. And therefore, this allows for us to minimize, in many cases, the risk of flooding in several communities. As it relates to Section 10, this enables the Chief Technical Officer to proactively plan the maintenance of drainage infrastructure, and it requires the officer to provide the owner or occupier of the affected land with at least 14 days notice before starting any maintenance work. Now, this is actually a new section. It recognizes, again, the importance of giving notice to owners and occupiers of land that works are being carried out by the drainage unit. And as I said earlier, currently our communications team would usually issue wider notices informing persons that work is happening in a particular area. But the very specific notice will now have a particular form in which that is communicated to residents so that they're aware that drainage infrastructure maintenance is actually taking place within their community. Section 11 speaks to the issue of building in a flood zone without permission. And this as well is a very new section. This prohibits anyone from erecting a structure in a flood zone without obtaining written permission from the minister. However, the Director of Planning and Development, in consultation with the Chief Technical Officer, has the authority to grant permission for construction in a flood zone. However, such permission will be subject to specific and essential terms and conditions to ensure safety and compliance. So essentially, there's a major prohibition on being able to erect a structure in a flood zone, but there may be circumstances which are brought to the attention of the relevant parties, which may require that a permission is granted. That permission will only be granted on certain terms and conditions. And that is done, obviously, through the Director of Planning and Development, as well as with consultation with the Chief Technical Officer. A person who contravenes this section is guilty of an offense under the new legislation and is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $20,000. Now, you will see throughout the course of this legislation some hefty fines being applied, and I'll take a minute to just speak to that for a moment. I think the recognition has come that since this legislation was initially enacted, that really and truthfully, many Barbadians really pay little attention to the issue of stormwater. And the feeling in the drainage unit, given all of the challenges that it encounters with its officers in the field, felt that in order to send a very strong message of how serious we are in terms of whether it's obstructions or obstructions which create offenses, that we needed to ensure that the penalties were stiff penalties that would send a message that we are now serious about our infrastructure, we're serious about our drainage, we're serious about the drainage unit being able to execute its duties effectively. And therefore, this particular provision, if you erect a structure in a flood area without permission, attracts a penalty of a fine up to $20,000 on summary conviction. It allows us, therefore, to try to effectively monitor building activities in flood zones, and in particular, what we would describe as the unpermitted developments, which potentially results in the obstruction or the diversion of storm water. Part 3 of the new bill speaks to the duties of owners and occupiers. And as I go through each of these, I'm sure that, again, there will be familiarity with many of my colleagues who have constituencies where these issues have arisen. We've had situations where persons have been planting trees and crops within our water courses, and in particular in areas that will be designated as flood zones. There are areas that are known for flooding, and you have situations where people have encroached in those areas and blocked the flow of water that would ordinarily run off and not impact communities. But you have situations where this has become a major issue, and the diversion of that water into other areas often creates problems for several households and communities in the surrounding area. Now, this section restricts an owner whose land is in a flood zone area from the planting, growing, and cultivation of any trees, crops, or other plants that is likely to prevent or may impede the free movement of water. And this also attracts a fine on summary conviction of $20,000. This provision is obviously necessary because, as I said, we've seen the planting of the trees, we've seen the shrubs, we've seen, in some cases, people extend their properties, and we see this a lot in the rural areas. They extend their properties in what would be considered, I guess, open space, and they take in the lands next to them, which then creates problems in terms of not only drainage being able to access the area, but certainly for them to be able to clean the area to allow the free flow of water. It also impacts on neighbors sometimes downstream, if they're upstream, because you find that the water is then blocked off, and it impacts, oftentimes on the communities in the surrounding area. Section 13 is also a new section which targets more so landowners who are engaged in commercial or industrial activities, and it seeks to have them install the stormwater disposal systems. Landowners utilizing their property for residential purposes, excluding as a dwelling, must take proactive measures to now install and maintain an effective stormwater disposal system on their premises. And a person who contravenes this provision is also guilty on summary conviction to a fine of $20,000. This section imposes a responsibility on owners to install these systems for properties, for instance, used as apartments, condominiums, as well as commercial or industrial. It is not targeted at the ordinary residential use. We're talking about where you have, as a developer or a homeowner, you have erected a structure which has several apartments inside of it, and as a consequence, there is improper drainage of our storm water. This is intended at those types of developments. In many cases, without the proper stormwater drainage systems, the reality is that these properties contribute a high percentage of runoff into the flow of the public roads, and it results in flooding on our highways. This is also intended to reduce the reliance on the government's highway drainage systems to dispose of runoff, because we find that a lot of times, instead of installing proper disposal systems on lands that are in these types of uses, you find that people try to adjust the flow of water to be able to send it onto the highways and onto the roads, as opposed to being able to either capture it or to be able to use the correct materials in order to be able to allow the water to seep underground. So this is intended to, again, place in the minds of those persons who are in the process of developing, and I know that planning will no doubt insist on this as well, to make sure that we take these approaches proactively. Obviously, for the people who already have done this, I would hope that they would be encouraged to make the transition, because this is a very serious discussion that we're having in terms of everybody's responsibility. It's not any one person's responsibility to deal with stormwater. It is all of our responsibility. And so I would want to encourage them, certainly, to take a look at the legislation and certainly try to ensure that they have the stormwater disposal systems in place on their particular sites. At section 14, which again is a new section, we've mandated that outfalls and drainage reserves be kept clear of obstructions. Coastal outfalls often become blocked due to seasonal formation of sand berms or other obstructions. This provision requires an owner or occupier of land to keep the outfalls and the drainage reserves clear from obstruction and to maintain the efficiency, the safety, and environmental integrity of the drainage system. It seeks to reduce the incidences of the blocked outfalls and drainage reserves, and it doesn't take away from the works that the ministry has to do, but in many cases we recognize that it is very difficult sometimes for us to gain access to some of these outfalls and drainage reserves. In many instances, the drainage department complains of blocked vehicles over the infrastructure. Sometimes people store materials in the area where the excavators and the bobcats have to gain access to. Sometimes you have even the practice of our contractors as well, depositing bulky waste. Instead of taking it to the appropriate sites for disposal, it sometimes is easier to just drop it alongside the road and go along with the business because they're trying to make a dollar. And therefore, this section is intended to ensure that we keep these areas clear, but also to create an offense for persons who disobey this section or act contrary to this section, and to also have those persons recognize that this is an offense, which is also punishable on summary conviction to a fine of $20,000. At section 15, again, another new section. This will require regular inspection and cleaning of the stormwater drainage wells and the structures. This section makes it imperative for the owner or the occupier of land with a stormwater drainage well or other drainage infrastructure to simply prioritize the inspections. What we have found is that sometimes people have the systems, but then they have not been maintaining them. And therefore, we create the onus on those persons who have actually met the requirements of having a system to ensure that there is a regular inspection. The legislation will now have clear timelines being established, which will require the owners and occupiers to inspect, clean, and clear the infrastructure at least every 2 years for wells that are 8 meters in depth, or at least once every 5 years for wells deeper than 8 meters. Regular inspections need to be done, and if needed, they need to clear and clean the systems to help prevent against the flooding and safeguard the communities surrounding them. This section creates an offense which is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $20,000. Also, I would want to point out too, under this section, we have a lot of property owners who install what is referred to as the lot level stormwater drainage systems. And what happens is that they bypass their drainage system and send the water flowing onto the public highways, which again contributes to a lot of the flooding that we see across the highways. So therefore, this section has taken that action or omission into account, and we have therefore created an offense specifically for persons who do not properly maintain their systems. Section 16 is also a new section. This requires the landowners or occupiers to pay the state for flood works which have been made necessary by their actions. As I mentioned earlier in the Western case, one of the things that was highlighted was the cost that it would be to the state now to have to make good the damage that was caused by a landowner seeking to build in a water course. And therefore, we recognize that there will be times, certainly, where some of these acts can be caught early, and we may need to be able to have a provision which allows for us to be able to go in as drainage, correct whatever those works are, simply because sitting down and talking to people sometimes doesn't get the desired result, as we often know. But if you have gone through the process of alerting them and you still realize that they are not taking action, and certainly the hurricane season may be around the corner, it requires of the state to be able to act expeditiously, to be able to go in and to carry out the works that are necessary to the structure, and to ensure that we are in a position to be able to seek compensation from the landowner for the works that have been carried out. The section at 16 also addresses the issue of owners and occupiers who damage, obstruct, or alter a highway in a way that negatively affects its drainage. Again, they will be required to reimburse the state for the cost of flood remediation works needed to correct the damage. Now, I think it's important to note here that one of the things that we're trying to do by this legislation is to get people to take action before these things happen. And I think that needs to be clear in the messaging as well, that it isn't intended for us to see what would have happened in the Western area happening again and then trying to play catch up after, but rather to make sure that we are in a position where we ask people to take responsibility for their actions and then allow for us to come in if necessary if they fail to do so. Now, part 4 of the new bill speaks to the duties of our land developers. And certainly on coming to this ministry, this has been perhaps one of the biggest challenges, but one of the things that I found very difficult to grasp in the initial stages as to why areas like the Goodland Gardens development and others that I think I'd heard about from when certainly my father was a minister was still on the cards for this administration in 2024-25 to have to address. And in discussion with the seniors in the ministry, it became clear that while permissions are often granted by the then planning department, in many cases, what has happened is that the enforcement mechanisms after to ensure that certain things are done by the developer often has not been what we have focused a lot on. So many times the permissions are granted, but there's nobody necessarily checking behind the developers to make sure that certain things have been completed in accordance with the permission that has been given. We've seen it as well, not just in Goodland Gardens, but we saw it in Atlantic Park as well. The Honourable member who represents that constituency has constantly been on my case since taking office to address the issues in Atlantic Park. And we've seen it in other developments across the country. Now, this is not a finger-pointing exercise. These are the plain cold facts. Because I've sat in many parish speaks and heard, residents speak across the length and breadth of the country about these types of developments. And the truth is, the reason why government is having to bear the burden and the cost of being able to address a lot of the flood engineering is simply because we didn't have this type of legislation in place, which allows us to be more proactive. And we are obviously taking the steps now to address through flood engineering designs being done the areas of Goodland Gardens. We're taking the steps to address not only there, but also Atlantic Park. We also have areas like Dover that has been on the radar for quite a long time. Places like Trent as well, and there are a couple of others that we have certainly highlighted that require an intervention by the government. Because when all is said and done, while the developer benefits from the sale of the properties, when there are challenges, nobody calls the developer's name. Ashdean Village as well. As I said, if I go around the room, Mr. Speaker, every MP will speak to an issue of which I am talking about. So we point the finger at government, we point the finger at the drainage unit. But what we fail to realize is sometimes without the tightening of the legislation and the resources obviously adequately there to oversee the legislation, that this is where, in a sense, sometimes developers have just gotten away with murder. Our responsibility as a government is to not only listen to our public, but to find ways in which to ensure that these types of cases do not become the norm, and rather that they become the exception or that they don't happen at all. But there are too many instances, certainly since I have become minister, that I recognize that these developments have become of great concern and great cost to government in terms of our intervention. Had we had perhaps the flood works plans, or we had the flood plans from the developers in the early stages, or the studies being done as is now envisaged by this piece of legislation, perhaps we may have been able to have a more coordinated approach and more terms and conditions being attached to the permission. But without those things, really we have seen developments gallop along with, in some cases, insufficient drainage systems, and obviously new developments created which have impacted on those developments. And that, of course, in particular, makes it very difficult to be able to recoup costs from a developer. So I just want to place that there because I know that that has been a long-standing concern that we've been having to address. Under this section at 17 as well, the current law really did not require any state entity to monitor and ensure that conditions related to surface water drainage were followed and enforced after conditional development is permitted. So it goes back to the point of planning. It gives the permission, but at the end of the day, after that, and after drainage has perhaps given a rough input, as the senior minister often calls for comments, after the initial comments are given, there's really no follow-up until the next occasion where we hear that there's been a downpour of rain in a particular area and there has been flooding in that area. So these are things that I think the public needs to be mindful of, that we are really playing catch-up, and that legislation is required now to really bring things in order, working hand in hand with planning, so that we're in a position to address these things frontally. Under this section, if requested by the Director of Planning and Development, it provides that a land developer must prepare a stormwater drainage plan for approval by the Chief Technical Officer and the Director of Planning and Development. So it's now tying the two entities together. The failing to effectively manage rainwater can obviously lead to severe flooding and damage to the communities, and existing drainage systems in communities may not be sufficient to be able to deal with the additional runoff from these new developments. So essentially, the land developers have a duty to now demonstrate how they will mitigate the impact of not only their development, but also by doing and carrying out the studies to make sure that it is clear how other areas may impact on their own community as well that they're developing. I don't have to remind members, and certainly the public, that sometimes the heavy rains, when left without being able to run off properly, that in many cases this creates breeding grounds for a lot of vermin, mosquitoes, and certainly pests. And that obviously has another public health issue that is of concern to us as well. So it is not in any of our interests to allow for flooding to take place, never mind to allow the water not to be pumped off as quickly as possible. For the first time, the section at section 17 actually provides a detailed checklist of the items that are to be included in a stormwater drainage plan from a developer. And it speaks to a few things. I'll just highlight a couple of them. Effective plans have to contain not just the name and location of the proposed development, it must also contain a map or a plan outlining the watershed in respect of the proposed development and indicating the estimated amount of water which is expected as runoff in the proposed development. It must also contain the location of the stormwater drainage systems, which they are going to introduce, the number of systems to be installed, and an estimate of the amount of stormwater likely to be generated from a 1 in 50-year return storm measured using rainfall intensity, duration, frequency curves produced by the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology, Hydrology, or such other institution as the Director of Planning and Development may specify. And then finally, if there's any other information which, in the opinion of the Chief Technical Officer or the Director of Planning and Development that they may require, they are also entitled to request that specific information. The plan has to be submitted to the Director of Planning and Development, and they then forward it to the Chief Technical Officer for consideration. Again, this creates an offense. Failure to follow this particular section creates an offense, and persons are liable on conviction to a fine of $20,000. It therefore removes for the first time that gray area in terms of interpreting what is required for a stormwater plan and its preparation, and provides more certainty in terms of the legislation and removes the need for what we see often, which are revised plans. Oftentimes, you submit a plan, then you hear again, you got to submit a revised plan, which comes at much cost to not only the developer, but also much frustration, I would imagine, to the chief technical officer as well as to the planning department as well. So we seek to address that by clause 17 in the new section. At section 18, this provision also relates to land developers. It requires the land developer to construct adequate drainage systems to mitigate the risk of flooding. A land developer under this section, if required to do so by the chief technical officer or the director of planning and development, must construct adequate drainage systems to effectively minimize the risk of flooding in a development. This section, while it is not mandatory, because again, it is if required to do so by the CTO or the director of planning, based on the information that is available to them, gives the CTO, the chief technical officer, or the director of planning and development the power to request this information from the land developer on adequate drainage systems in the development that is to be created. And over the years, what we have seen is that some of the developers have installed inefficient drainage systems, and some have also built systems which do not conform either to the design layout or to the specifications that obviously planning certainly and the ministry would wish to see done. In effect, this presents the challenges for the team in order to be able to effectively carry out routine maintenance. And obviously this section will now allow for a more proactive approach, which certainly is also borne out by the new planning and development legislation, in order to allow for adequate steps to be taken before persons actually embark on full development. Part 5, which relates to the general prohibitions, section 19, establishes general prohibitions related to flood zones. This provision speaks to ensuring the integrity of the drainage infrastructure by providing that individuals are prohibited from disposing of water on or in any public infrastructure associated with the drainage of stormwater, unless permission is granted by the chief technical officer. And the CTO can only grant, under this legislation, permission on certain terms and conditions as he may deem fit. What has resulted in this provision is that there's a high incidence across the island of the disposal of stormwater, and sometimes water containing household, chemical, animal, feces, soils, and oils waste. And we recognize that unless we again send a clear message that the disposal of these things into the water system is not correct, that again, we too will be contributing to a lot of the challenges that we face when it relates to flooding in the hurricane season in particular. The truth is too that the improper disposal of the runoff also threatens the contamination of the soils, the drainage infrastructure, our ground and our marine waters as well. And so we've deemed this as well an area which will create an offense whereby a person will be liable on summary conviction to a fine of $20,000. Section 20 deals with an area which, again, I think every Barbadian can relate to, where we have a serious issue with the disposal of waste. We've been seeing garbage, debris, bulk waste, and other materials blocking the drainage systems and the water courses. I would have to say that I never could have imagined how serious an issue this was until I took up this position. But seeing some of the debris that comes out of our drainage infrastructure is mind-boggling. And I'm sure previous ministers have also shared the shock and awe of things that come out of our systems. They hinder the flow of water, and in particular during the hurricane season, create endless problems for us. I mean, we see the plastics, we see the sanitary napkins, we see old shoes, we see clothing, we see everything of every description being disposed of, in some cases not deliberately, but certainly willfully, blocking the drainage systems and the water courses. And one of the concerns that we have is that, again, we need to send a clear message that disposing not of the one plastic container when you drop it out through the car window. We're not talking about that alone. We're talking about persons who willfully dump things within the drainage systems and cause blockages. Where we find that those acts are being committed, this new provision provides for persons to be liable on summary conviction to a fine of $20,000. You can soon call this the $20,000 legislation just now. Section 21, again, another new section, also speaks to another bugbear of the ministry and certainly of the general public when drainage has to visit a number of the sites across the country. It provides that individuals are prohibited from building fences, walls, hedges, or any other structures over or around drainage infrastructure. It is therefore a provision that is intended to guarantee easy access for inspections and maintenance for the persons carrying out their works, and to ensure that the drainage systems are able to function effectively. We often find that as a result of persons, again, taking in property that is next to them, where they know that there's a system on the land sometimes, and they still take it in because it gives them additional space. We also have found, I know there was one in, I think it was in Atlantic Park that we visited, where the actual guard wall was sat on top of the drainage infrastructure. Now, in order for the ministry to be able to go in through the drainage unit to rectify the issue there, because that apparently was causing a lot of the flooding in the area, it means that notice has to be given to the owner of the property. A time obviously has to be allocated for the visit to the property, but there's going to have to be a cost incurred by government, first of all, if the occupier and the owner of the land doesn't remove it, to remove the guard wall. Because the only way that you can fix the drainage infrastructure is if you remove the offending material. And I'm telling you, we have seen these incidences quite frequently in the course of working with the drainage unit. And it presents a lot of challenges for the staff, especially when they are trying to go about doing their job, but they're often confronted with these types of scenarios where people can see that, you can see it is deliberate in terms of building infrastructure over drainage infrastructure. Now, granted, there may be situations where you didn't know that it was any kind of drainage infrastructure, but I have seen more occasions where it is clear that what persons have built over with their guard walls and their fences is clearly prohibiting access from the people who at the ministry may need to come in and to clean it. And I beg, landowners and certainly occupiers to pay attention to these things, because while you may think that what you're doing is of benefit to you, the truth is that what you do today is also a detriment to other people in the surrounding communities, and sometimes even to yourself when we have these heavy downpours of rain as well. So you can't look at this as if it is only for your benefit, but people must start to realize that their actions also have actions and certainly consequences on other people as well. Section 22 relates to other obstructions of drainage infrastructure, because it has become, this is more like the catch-all provision, because what has happened is that people will place objects over or in drainage infrastructure in a manner which restricts access to the infrastructure. We have found, apart from the garbage and the construction materials, we have also found people have put in concrete drop-ins. We have seen people mixing concrete in and over drainage infrastructure. We've seen people also covering drainage infrastructure with soil because maybe they want to extend their garden bed. But these are all things which, when you do them, has a direct impact on our ability to manage and to mitigate flooding in the country. So this section creates, basically speaks to acts which prevent or restrict or will frustrate the ability of the drainage unit to respond and to carry out routine maintenance activities. Part 6 deals essentially with the powers of entry and inspection for the maintenance of drainage infrastructure. It grants the Chief Technical Officer or an authorized representative the authority to enter premises for the purpose of inspecting and ensuring the maintenance of the infrastructure. If maintenance is required, the CTO or other authorized person must provide a notice detailing the nature of the maintenance needed and the time frame within which the maintenance should be completed. Again, this is critical now going forward, so people know what is being done. They have time to plan their business. Somebody needs to be home while the persons are working. This provision allows for the notice to be given so that persons can from the drainage unit can carry out their powers effectively. Section 24 provides a power to remove an obstruction in an emergency. This provides the CTO or any other authorized person to move any vehicle or any other thing which restricts access to an area where an emergency exists. It also provides that the owner will be liable for all costs associated with the removal of the obstruction. Again, we have found that during the day, in particular, when the officers are out, you find a lot of vehicles parked over the infrastructure, which again impedes our drainage workers from being able to gain access to do the cleaning. This will now give the CTO the necessary powers to be able to have a swift response, to be able to move, particularly in emergencies. We're not just going to pick up people's vehicles and move them, so people need not get afraid of that. But the intention is simply where we recognize that we need access in an emergency to be able to give the CTO the requisite power to be able to gain access to that particular location. Any person who contravenes this section is guilty of an offense and is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $20,000. The new bill also introduces the payment of a fixed penalty. And this is a new feature, but it is also becoming very common in a lot of the other legislation because we recognize that we don't want to be tying up the court's time with a lot of matters that could be dealt with administratively by the payment of a penalty. So this speaks to the normal way in which we, the officer will obviously fill out a form ensuring that the details with regards to where the person must pay, what the offense is, all of those things are listed on it, and the person is given a specific time within which to pay so that they can avoid a long, protracted process sometimes in the court. It is also taken at section 27 that any certificate which is signed by the clerk of the court will be sufficient evidence for either the payment or the non-payment of the fee, and it will be accepted as taken unless the contrary is proven. Section 28, which would have been formerly section 14, speaks to the obstruction of any of the authorized persons sent in by the Chief Technical Officer. An obstruction being, just like you have an obstruction of an officer in the execution of his duty, we treat to this very seriously because sometimes even with all of the processes being followed, which is notice, you know, a quiet exchange with the landowner or the occupier, sometimes these situations lead to contention. And sometimes people, when they are told that they are doing something wrong, their first reaction is obviously to become very defensive and certainly offensive as well. And therefore, we have a responsibility as well to not only make sure that our officers follow the correct procedures, but also to protect our officers once they have followed the correct procedures by ensuring that anybody who assaults them, who resists them in terms of the execution of their duties, who obstructs, who intimidates or interferes with them, or generally hinders the Chief Technical Officer or the authorized personnel, that person recognizes that that will be punishable with a substantial fine up to $50,000, imprisonment for up to 12 months or possibly both. Now, in the previous legislation, the fine was $2,500 or imprisonment of 12 months or both. And I cannot recall from speaking to the officers that this has ever been enforced, but what I can tell you is that the examples given by officers of their interaction sometimes with difficult public is well known in the ministry, and I know that all ministers can testify to that. So really, we want to take the role of the drainage unit seriously moving forward, and to ensure that people understand that once they follow the correct procedure, that they are not to be treated lightly in the execution of their duties. As Section 29, which is formerly Section 8, this provision allows the minister, if he's of the opinion that lands or premises are required for the purpose of executing works, that he can act in accordance with the powers conferred under the Land Acquisition Act. Again, not an unfamiliar provision. Obviously, if we have to, as they say, take lands or utilize lands more appropriately, sometimes it becomes necessary. We do it even when we're doing acquisitions in relation to roads. Sometimes we have to acquire lands because we have to widen the road. Sometimes we need to acquire additional square footage in order to carry out the work. So this is not an uncommon provision. As Section 30, which would have been formerly Section 9, individuals can seek compensation for any damage caused by the execution of flood-related works or for any lands or interests that have been taken or utilized. And any dispute regarding the amount of compensation payable will be resolved through arbitration in accordance with Section 32. That is fairly explanatory. Compensation, again, remains a part of the legislation. The important part here is that persons obviously have a cause of action that they can basically take before the courts if necessary. Section 31 deals with, which is formerly Section 10, provides the matters which the court will take into account in determining compensation. The provision relating to arbitration is set out at Section 32. And Section 33, which was formerly Section 15. In this section, if the owner or the occupier of land fails to keep the drainage infrastructure and the outfalls clear, the Chief Technical Officer or other authorized person may issue a written notice to the owner or occupier. This notice will require them to perform the necessary work to remedy the issue to the satisfaction of the Chief Technical Officer. The notice must specify the type of work that needs to be done and the time frame within which it must be completed. And if the owner or the occupier does not comply with the notice, then the Chief Technical Officer or other authorized person may carry out the necessary work themselves and will charge the owner or occupier for the actual costs incurred in executing the work. So this section essentially gives the owner the opportunity to carry out the works themselves once pointed out to them within a specific time frame, and if they fail to do so, it allows drainage to be able to step in to do the work. We have found, and why has this become so important, is because sometimes, you know, as we say in Bajan parlance, we give a man a blight, they tell us that they're gonna fix something, then they don't fix it, then it results in flooding in other areas because we give them a blight. So this is the provision that is no longer giving you the blight, because it is quite simply saying you have now a specific time frame, a specific timeline within which to do the works that are outlined. It may be remove your wall, which is on the drainage infrastructure. If you fail to do it, we will do it at our cost, but we are going to recoup the cost for so doing from you. So this addresses a problem and a challenge that the drainage unit can certainly speak to on a day-to-day basis. Section 34 would have been formerly Section 13. This relates to notices, where the notices have to be served on the owner or occupier by leaving it with the owner, with the occupier or some other person in the residence, or by placing it in a conspicuous part of the premises where there is no occupier. Section 35 repeals essentially the Prevention of Floods Act, and Section 36 obviously will allow this legislation, once passed by both houses, to be brought into operation on a date fixed by proclamation and will bind the state. And that, Mr. Speaker, is the essence of this new bill, the Stormwater Management Bill, which will replace and repeal the Prevention of Flood Act, which recognizes for the first time, I think, the times that we are living in. It recognizes that it cannot be business as usual. I don't think that we can be on the world stage talking about climate change and still having dated legislation governing the operations of the certainly the Ministry of Public Works and certainly the drainage unit in particular. If we are to get serious about this, it also requires certainly the raising the level of expertise within the drainage unit, as we do and we're looking to do in other agencies. Where we don't have the resources in-house, obviously we have to go to best practices across the world to be able to work with our teams to be able to carry out this much needed work. But I trust that this legislation, once we start to do the public education, which will obviously form a component once this is passed, that both landowners and owners and occupiers, average Barbadians, understand that we are all in this together, that this is not a government thing. This is not something that we are doing, that yes, we're responsible for the infrastructure, and we're responsible for repairing and rehabilitating infrastructure. But equally, Barbadians and developers and homeowners also have a responsibility as well to dispose of storm water on their premises, because it has a direct impact on surrounding communities. And I think once we appreciate and understand that this legislation is intended to have a kind of whole of society approach focus, but also more preparatory work being done as opposed to waiting until we have these situations that we have seen in the past occurring, then I think that certainly the legislation will be supported. Interestingly, in the 1996 debate, the then opposition supported the bill, the Prevention of Floods bill. And I am certain today that the leader of this opposition would perhaps, no doubt, I'm sure he will point out any legal issues that may arise, and we appreciate any submissions that he may make based on his experiences as well. But I think this is an area which is not contentious on either side. Certainly it wasn't back then, and I don't anticipate it will be contentious now. But again, we have to allow the legislation to give the drainage unit the teeth to be able to start the process now of being able to act so that we can mitigate the risk of flooding, both for landowners, but also for our land developers as well across the country. So, Mr. Speaker, with those few words, I therefore commend this bill to this chamber, and I beg that this bill be read a second time.
Honourable, brace yourself.
I'm obliged to you, Your Honour, and I will accept the invitation of the Honourable Member for St. Michael South East to respond objectively, and while doing so, I would want to commend her very comprehensive traversal of legislation, which the public may think is boring, but it really is